All right, guys. Well, welcome to the Pulse of Miami Church. I don't know, talking about just kind of music. Have you guys ever listened to a song and you like the song and it sounds nice or whatever, and then like years later you listen to the words and you're like, oh, I can't believe I've been jamming to that song for so long, right? Well, it's kind of the opposite here in church, and this is what I want to encourage you to do. Pay attention to the words that we're singing here on Sunday morning. Especially the song, this song that they sang was great. The song that they're going to sing at the end is really, it's really one of my favorites. Not just because I like the tune, but because the message is so powerful. And so I hope that works for you. Today, we're going to continue our study into 1 Kings. And today, if you're a theological geek like me, you are going to absolutely love this story. All right, this is a great story theologically, and it's an interesting thing because there's a practical message here, and then there's a really cool theological message, right? So we're going to get into this. But I love this stuff. I love it, right? But the question that I'm going to ask today on the practical side is, how do we know whose advice we can trust? How do we know whose advice we can trust? This is one of the most important questions that you could possibly ask. Okay, so number one, if you're not asking advice for your important decisions, that's mistake number one. Okay, you should always be asking advice. You don't have to take the advice. It's free. People give it out, for free. They don't charge you for it. You should be asking for advice. But number two, the question that you should ask is, how do you know whose advice that you can actually trust? I'll give you an example. Michelle and I were actually thinking about purchasing our first house. We had a condo together, but it was a one-bedroom condo. Man, I wish we would have held on to it. It would have been so valuable today. But whatever. So we had this condo, but we really wanted to. Well, Michelle wanted to start a family, and so it was like, that's not going to work in a one-bedroom condo. So we wanted a house, right? The problem was it was back in like 2002, 2003, and the market was starting to really ramp up, right? It got all the way to 2007, and that's when the big crash happened, okay? But it was starting to really just crank, and so Michelle and I were trying to save money, but, it wasn't happening fast enough. So the advice of my father, who I trust, who I know he loves me, my father said, son, you need to just buy a house now because you're not going to be able to outsave the market. The market's going to rise faster than you can save. But then I also had somebody else that I trusted, who was my Uncle Charlie, that we actually talked about. And my Uncle Charlie was saying, no, you don't have enough money to buy this house. You're going to put yourself in a financial problem. Now, my father, on the one hand, he loves me and he wants the absolute best for me. I know that. My uncle, I think he wants the best for me, but some of his motivation is always like disagreeing with my father. Like, whatever position my father takes, he likes to take the opposite. So it's kind of like, is he saying that because of that? But I will say this about my uncle. My uncle had bought many properties in his life. Okay? So he had some expertise there. So I've got two people, and they're both giving me advice. How do you know whose advice that you can trust? It's a great question. Some of you guys here, you've got some financial questions that to be honest with you, if you're not asking other people for advice, you're making a mistake. But whose advice can you trust? Or when it comes to dating and marriage, have you noticed in our society that it's kind of like this thing where you're supposed to figure that out for yourself? But I'm going to tell you this. When it comes to dating and marriage, if there's ever a place where you should be asking other people's advice, it's in that. Because let me tell you something, that can ruin your life if you pick the wrong person. And so the question that we need to ask is, how do we know whose advice that we can actually trust? And finally, for those of you who are in school, you're trying to figure out what school, what direction do I want my life to go when it comes to my career? How do we know whose advice we can trust? In order to answer this question, we're going to open up to 1 Kings chapter 12. Now remember last week, okay, and this is so important that you remember what happened last week. Remember how King Solomon messed up and he married these foreign wives, and then the foreign wives kind of encouraged him to worship these other gods, right? And so finally, Yahweh, God, he got upset and he goes, all right, that's enough, King Solomon. I'm going to rip out 10 of the tribes of Israel out of your hand, and I'm going to give it to somebody who's working for you. He says, but I promised your dad that I wouldn't do this to you, so I'm going to have to do it to your son, Rehoboam. Okay? So remember, God said it last chapter. God's will was, I'm going to rip 10 tribes out of your hand, okay, and you are going to be remaining with 2 tribes, which were in Judah and Benjamin. God already said it. But yet, how does it come about? Check this out. This is a great story. 1 Kings chapter 12. Rehoboam. Now, there's going to be another guy by the name of Jeroboam. I don't want you, and it's kind of confusing. Here's my little way of remembering who's who, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Rehoboam, okay? In Spanish, the word rey is king, like El Rey Jesus is the King Jesus. So when you hear Rehoboam, he's the king. He's King Solomon's son. Okay. So Rehoboam went to Shechem. Why would someone go to Shechem? Because that's where they would crown you king. For all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. Verse 2. And as soon as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. Okay? So now the stage is set. Rehoboam is there. They're supposed to crown him king. But the guy who's supposed to take the other 10 tribes has shown up. Right? Verse 3. And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, this is the king, or they're about to crown him king. Verse 4. Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. Okay? A yoke was actually something that they would put on an oxen. Okay? It was what would connect them to the plow or to the cart or whatever it was pulling. Okay? And a yoke could be light and easy, like a cart, or it could have like a huge plow on it, and it would be a heavy burden, right? And so what they were saying is your father, King Solomon, yeah, he was great. And he built a lot of stuff. But man, he was hard on us. Right? So all we're asking you, if you're going to be king, is I want you to lighten the burden. Don't be like your father. Lighten the burden a little bit on us, and we'll serve you. So verse 5, wisest thing that he does. He says to them, go away for 3 days, then come again to me. So the people went away. Now, real quick, just pause. Let's transport back into our lives today. Really, really good advice. Whenever you need to make a big decision, take a few days. Okay? Take some time. This is something that my dad taught me, and I realize that most people don't have a father teaching them this. Take some time before you make a decision. Have you ever noticed that a salesperson, when they know that they've got your attention, when you go, let me go think about it, that's like the last thing they want you to do? You know why? Because 90% of the time, if you think about it, you don't buy it, right? And so give yourself some time. Think about it, right? I really wanted a tattoo when I was a kid. And my parents said, okay, wait till you're 18. And by the time I was 18, I was like, yeah. See? Anyway. So go away for 3 days, come and come back. So give me time to talk to people, to think. Wise thing that the king did. Verse 6. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men. who had stood before Solomon his father while he was yet alive, saying, how do you advise me to answer this people? Now, before we see their response, I want to remind you who King Solomon was. King Solomon was the wisest man who ever walked the face of the planet. And these are the guys who would give him advice, right? These are good people to be talking to. And so what was their advice to him? Verse 7, and they said to him, if you will be a servant to these people today and serve them and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. Right? If you will just be humble. I'm sure that they were remembering when Solomon was young, a young king. And remember what Solomon asked for? He could have asked God for wealth, for power, but what did he ask for? I just need wisdom. I need wisdom so that I can serve these people. And God blessed him, right? And so they're probably thinking, look, if you will take your father's footsteps, it'll go really well. Verse 8, but he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. He abandoned the counsel. Now, why would he abandon their counsel? I'm going to be honest with you, I don't blame him. I want you to kind of put your feet in the sandals of King Rehoboam for a minute. Okay? King Rehoboam, who was his grandfather? His grandfather was King David. King David literally killed Goliath with his own two hands when he was a kid. Right? King David actually was one of the toughest guys in the ancient Near East. In fact, all the other nations, when they heard the name David, they would tremble. David was a tough dude. That was his granddaddy. And his dad was the wisest person who ever walked the face of the planet and built the kingdom into this wonderful kingdom. So imagine Rehoboam, he's like, well, what kind of king am I going to be? Am I going to be tough? Am I going to be wise? Like, what's going to be my legacy? And the first thing that they ask him to do is to be a servant. Right? If you'll just serve the people, they'll serve you. It's like, I don't want to be that kind of a king. Like who wants to be the nice king? Oh, he was just so nice. Right? Nice kings don't accomplish anything. And so he didn't like that. He didn't want his legacy to be that. And so he went and he said, let me go get some advice from my buddies that I grew up with. Verse 9. And he said to them, what do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, lighten the yoke that your father put on us? Verse 10. And the young men who had grown up with him said to him, thus you shall speak to this people who said to you, your father made your yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. Now that's a weird thing to say. But I'm sure we've got sayings today that they would be scratching their heads at, back then. But essentially what this apparently meant, I guess it was a popular saying back then, was I'm more bad to the bone in my little finger than my father was in his thighs. You think my father was tough? I'm way tougher than my father. This is their advice. This is what they're saying that he should say. Verse 11, they continue. And now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips. I will discipline you with scorpions. What were they essentially saying? You want to be a tough king. You want to be greater than your father. Greater than your grandfather. Verse 12. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day. As the king said, come to me again the third day. So he thought about it for 3 days. What am I going to say to the people? So when the people came back, verse 14, he spoke to them, verse 13. And the king answered the people harshly, forsaking the counsel that the old men had given him. Verse 14, and he spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So he took his buddy's advice. Verse 15, so the king did not listen to the people. Here's the theological thing. For it was a turn of affairs brought about by Yahweh, that he might fulfill his word, which Yahweh spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. God had already spoken through a prophet and said, I'm going to rip the 10 of the tribes out of the hand of Rehoboam. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. God had sovereignly said, this is what I'm going to do. But he accomplished it through a free will decision that Rehoboam made. Do you get where this is going? Right? And a lot of people say, well, did Rehoboam really have a choice? I mean, didn't God say that this was going to happen? Yeah, Rehoboam had a choice. I mean, it's clear that he had a choice. Like he was mulling over this choice for a long time. Here's what's great about this, okay? So a lot of people say, well, if God already knows it's going to happen, then do you really have a choice? The answer is yes. You know, God could have done this at the beginning of his kingdom. Could have done it at the end. Rehoboam could have made a good choice here. But here's what I want you to see. God is so powerful. God is so big that no matter what choice you make, he is going to accomplish his will. Does that make sense? And I want you to think about how complicated this world is. We all have free will. God has given us all free will, and we get to make up our own choices. And our choices determine what the future is going to look like. And so my choices are interacting with Claude's choices, are interacting with Stephanie's choices, and on and on and on and on. And you would think to yourself, wow, with this chaos, with this mess of all this free will, how could God ever accomplish anything? Because God is bigger than you ever imagined that he was. God is so big that he can give you free will and he can still accomplish exactly what he wants to accomplish. Now you see why I like this story, right? Let's continue. Verse 16, and when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, to the wise men, the people answered the king, what portion do we have in David? In other words, the line of David. We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. In other words, it doesn't benefit us to have him as a king at all. Like, at one point it benefited us to be under King David because we had protection and all this kind of stuff. But this guy doesn't care about us at all. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David. So Israel went to their own tents. So basically they said, we're leaving. We're out of here. We're not going to crown you as our king. Take care of your own house. You worry about Judah. We're leaving. Verse 17. But Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. Verse 18. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was a taskmaster over the forced labor. That means slaves. So he was like, hey, go tell them that they can't leave. And so this guy starts, whoosh, and they go, oh yeah? And they take stones and they kill that guy. And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. Verse 19, Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Verse 20, and when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all of Israel. In other words, the northern tribes. There was none that followed the house of David but the tribe of Judah only, meaning Judah and Benjamin. And so you had the southern kingdom with King Rehoboam, and then you had the northern kingdom with King Jeroboam. You guys remember the New Testament? What do they call them in the New Testament? Are they called Israelites in the New Testament? The answer is no. What do they call them? They call them Jews. Why do they call them Jews? Because they're from the tribe of Judah. They're part of the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom becomes Samaria in the New Testament. Okay? You had the northern kingdom, Samaria, the southern kingdom, Judah. See, this is why it's important to go through the history, because you start making connections, right? Now watch this. This is crazy. This is where the descent starts happening. It starts to get bad. Verse 26, and Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will return back to the house of David. Verse 27, if this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of Yahweh at Jerusalem. He had a problem. He had all of these people who were supposed to be following him as king over the northern tribes, but there was this huge temple. That's where the people would go worship Yahweh, was at this temple. He goes, man, if I let them go back and worship there, they're going to leave me. He says, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. I've got to do something about this. I can't have them going back to the temple to worship Yahweh. Verse 28, this is crazy. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. For those of you who have studied the Bible a little bit, do you remember another story in the Bible that had golden calf? Right? Remember Moses was leading them out of Egypt? And then Moses says, I'm going to go talk to Yahweh on the mountain. I'll be back. Don't misbehave. He goes up on the mountain. And while he's up on the mountain, they're like, hey, let's make a golden calf. Now, were they worshiping the golden calf? Theologically, I think they were actually worshiping Yahweh, who was supposedly the rider on the golden calf. The problem is that over time, they just start worshiping the golden calf, which is exactly what we see in this passage. If this people, so the king took counsel, made 2 calves of gold, and he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. That's where God wanted them to go. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Verse 29, and he set one in Bethel and the other one all the way up in Dan. And for those of you who were part of my class, do you remember when we talked about the bulls of Bashan? That's what it's referring to. Because Dan was in the area of Bashan, and this was verse 30. This thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to go before one of these golden calves. Now what's interesting, back to the New Testament, remember the woman at the well? The Samaritan woman at the well? Remember she had like all these husbands, and the guy that she was with at the time, and so when Jesus tells her that, she says, I see you're a prophet. And then you remember she says, you Jews say that we should worship down there in Jerusalem on that mountain. But my wise people say that we should be worshiping on this mountain up here. That's why she was saying that. Because of what Jeroboam had done all those years before. Over 1,000 years before. Fascinating. So now you see a little bit of history. We get a little bit of a good theological story. Now let's get back to the practical. How do we know whose advice we can trust? Because clearly, Rehoboam trusted the wrong people. Now, was it just because some people were older? No, there's some pretty stupid older people, I'm going to be honest with you. All right, sometimes there's really wise young people. There's, obviously, more older, hopefully more wisdom, but it's not necessarily the case. How do we know whose advice we can trust? Trust advice from people who care about your life and not about your feelings. Let me say that again. Trust advice from people who care about your life and not about your feelings. What do I mean by that? You need to surround yourself with people who aren't afraid to tell you something that you don't want to hear. In fact, I'm going to tell you, most of the advice that you need to hear in your life is stuff that you don't want to hear. Think about Rehoboam. He got good advice from those men, but he didn't want to hear that advice. And so he went to the people who he knew were going to tell him exactly what he wanted to hear. So we need to trust advice from people who care about your life, but not necessarily about your feelings. And here's what I'm going to tell you, especially when you're emotionally invested in a decision that you're making, the last person that you should trust is yourself. The last feeling that you should trust is your own feelings. Right? Because when you're emotionally invested, you're not thinking clearly. My first house that Michelle and I wanted to buy, we really wanted to buy a house. My dad was saying, yeah, you should buy it now. My uncle was saying, you don't have enough money. And so Michelle and I, we took both of their advice, and we started looking for a house. And we found that there was these houses in Homestead that they were still building. And so we could put a little bit of money down right now, and it would lock in the price today, but yet we would still have another 8 months while the house was being built to save the rest of the money. So think about it. We actually did both of the advice, right? My dad was like, you need to lock in a price today. But then my uncle was saying, you need more money. And so that's what we did. And so my wife and I, we sold the condo. We lived with my grandmother. That's a whole other story. Granny was one of the most interesting 80-some-odd-year-old ladies ever. But for 8 months we did that. We socked away every penny that we could. And when we closed, we had enough to put 20% down so that we didn't have to pay the PMI insurance. And God was good to us. Why? Because both of the people, they cared more about our life and not about our feelings. They were willing to tell us things that we didn't want to hear. And so we realized that their advice was worth it. Another funny story. Michelle and I wanted to buy a Jeep. We got the bug. We wanted a Jeep really bad. And so we came home with this Jeep. That was back when one of the sales techniques was like, hey, why don't you just take it home and think about it, you know? Of course, all the way home, you're just falling in love with this thing, you know? And so I come to my dad's house to show it to him, and he was like, that is the stupidest idea you could ever, come up with. Well, I wasn't going to listen to him. I was too far gone, like I wanted the stupid Jeep, right? But the one thing that my dad told me is, he says, well, if you're not going to listen to me, the least that you can do is get a Consumer Reports to make sure that you're getting a good price on it. Great idea. So I did a Consumer Reports. I did all the math. I figured out exactly how much they paid for it, how much, a good markup would be. And I go, man, they gave us a good price. And then Consumer Reports says, beware, don't let them do this or this or this to you. So I went back. I'm all happy, ready to sign the deal. And the guy goes, well, but we're going to have to do this fee and that fee and this fee. And I went, hey, wait a minute. So it came out to like $500 more. I'm like, I'm not paying that. And so Michelle goes, are you really going to blow up this deal for $500? I go, yeah. And she goes, well, you're embarrassing me. I'm going to go. So she goes and sits in the old car. And so the guy comes back and he's like, where's your wife? And I go, she's pissed. And he goes, Phil, I'm losing money on this deal. And I took out the paper and I go, no, you're not. Here's how much you paid for it. Here's the markup. Da da da. And you know what? I walked out of there with a Jeep that day. But I also walked away with some important information on how to do a negotiation. And it all came from the advice of somebody who I trusted, because he loved me enough to tell me the things that I didn't want to hear. You need people like that in your life when you're making financial decisions. You really need people like that when it comes to your love life. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not advocating for arranged marriages. I'm definitely not advocating for that. However, David and I were talking about this. What was it, last week? And David was pointing out, and he's right, that arranged marriages actually last a lot better than what we do. Why? Well, at least a portion of it is because there's some wise people in your life that go, I know you, and I know who would work really well with you. Now, I'm not saying that we should go to arranged marriages, but what I am telling you is that you should go to the people in your life that you trust, that really know you, and say, hey, is this person right for me? Because I'm telling you, out of all of the mistakes that you could possibly make, picking the wrong person to try to live your life with is probably one of the worst ones that you can make. Trust advice from people who care about your life and not about your feelings, who are willing to tell you he's not good for you or she's crazy, right? Like, you need to hear that. Finally, for those of us who are trying to figure out what school, what career, what direction do we need to take in life, man, talk to the people who care about your life and not about your feelings. Let's read our verse together today, Matthew 23, verse 12. Read it with me. For those who exalt themselves... What? All right. Next slide. Anybody here? All right. Okay, son, I'll do it myself. All right, ready? Help me out. Matthew 23, 12. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. I really, really wish that Rehoboam would have humbled himself and taken something about you theologically. Lord, to start putting the history of the Bible together and start making those connections. But Lord, more than that, Lord, I pray that you would help us to surround ourselves with people who are wise and who care enough about us to tell us the things that we don't want to hear. Lord, every one of us needs that. Lord, there are some older people here today who need to make themselves available to the younger people, so that when they're trying to make decisions, Lord, that they can help out with that. Lord, give us wisdom when we're giving advice. Lord, I pray, Holy Spirit, Lord, I pray that you would lead us and guide us. And Lord, I pray that this church family would become vital to our spiritual growth as we grow together. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.